Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Grayzone. It's another Friday live stream. We are now live on YouTube. We're live on Elon Musk's Twitter, CIA X, information warfare playhouse. And we are now live as well on Rockfin. Here with Anya Parampil, our resident Venezuela expert, who is the author of Corporate Coup, the book you see over her shoulder, Venezuela and the End of Empire. And we want to start, as Amy Goodman would say, we begin in Caracas, Venezuela, but we're going to cover, as you can see from the AI art that I so masterfully created, we're going to cover the march to war, Israel's march to war, with the entire axis of resistance, which has been triggered by a series of cascading events that could have easily been avoided. We're going to cover Gaza. We're going to cover the U.S. presidential election, and I hope we can cover the largest prisoner swap between the U.S. and Russia since the Cold War, which has resulted in the freedom of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. But we really want to get started with Venezuela. And for those of you watching, buy the book, Corporate Coup. It's now on sale at Amazon. You can get it through Or Books, Or Books, the publisher, if you don't want to support Jeff Bezos. But get the book, because that is the background to everything that's happening right now, particularly today, after this statement in which the U.S., Tony Blinken, has officially recognized Edmundo Gonzalez. This is a statement by the U.S. Department of State assessing the results of Venezuela's presidential election, determining before any public analysis of the data that Venezuela has stolen, or Venezuela's government led by President Nicolas Maduro, who is the candidate running for re-election, the incumbent president, stole the election, and that the U.S. recognizes his opponent, Edmundo Gonzalez, who is a stand-in for longtime coup plotter and de facto U.S.-backed opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. So, Anya, what does this statement actually mean? Does this represent a change in U.S. policy?
No, it simply represents a continuation of the failed Trump policy of recognizing a shadow corporate-led government in Venezuela. And on one hand, I'm not surprised, because so much depends on that flimsy fantasy recognition of a government that has no authority, no control over the military, no control over the ministries, no control over the borders of Venezuela. But just by existing in the minds of Washington, that shadow government provides the pretext for the continued seizure and looting of Venezuela's international assets. So one of the main cases I cover in my book is the fight over Citgo Petroleum, the largest Venezuelan asset stored abroad that is now slated to be liquidated in a U.S. court in order to pay back creditors, corporate creditors, or other corporations that had a stake or claim lodged against the the Venezuelan government. And the only way that this litigation can go forward is if the status quo remains in place. This fake government is given authority over the Venezuelan state in the eyes of U.S. courts. If the U.S. had reversed its recognition of a shadow government in Venezuela, then suddenly those cases would become far more complicated, because the actual elected and internationally recognized Venezuelan government led by Maduro would have an authority in U.S. courts once again. So it's all of this, all of the fighting over who's actually in charge of the government really is just a cover for the the continued looting and theft of Venezuela's wealth. So it doesn't surprise me on one hand that the U.S. doubled down on the policy. On the other hand, it seems ridiculous at this point to continue recognizing a government that has no legitimate authority. It obviously jeopardizes the status of Venezuelan migrants in the country because they still don't have an embassy here that can properly give them services. And it hinders the ability of the US government to just directly negotiate with the actual real government in Caracas, whether that's in terms of trade or other areas of commerce. So how long can this charade continue? I'm not sure. I think they would at least like it to go until Citgo is fully liquidated. But on the other hand, there's that gold sitting in the Bank of England, and I think London would like it to be there indefinitely. So I don't know what it will take actually for the U.S. and its allies to reverse this ridiculous policy. I mean, it doesn't matter, again, who wins elections or whether or not the elections were fair. The U.S. was going to go forward with this no matter what.
Yeah. I mean, so Edmundo Gonzalez steps in for Juan Guaido, who's now like a professor at some, Florida International University. I've heard him speak English, and he's not very articulate. I don't know how he got through George Washington University, but the point is, when no one knew who Juan Guaido was before he was appointed president, and no one knew who Edmundo Gonzalez was. And you see Edmundo Gonzalez on camera, he doesn't seem to know where he is. He's very much like Joe Biden. He has trouble standing up at his own rallies. He's sort of disappeared. But the background on Edmundo Gonzalez and how he found his way into this place is really interesting and highlights the agenda of the U.S. as he becomes the new Guaido. This is a Salvadoran priest who is talking about Edmundo Gonzalez's role. I'm not going to play the video in the 1980s in El Salvador. And this Twitter user is referring to Edmundo Gonzalez as El Matacuras and saying he was aligned with the American interests in El Salvador in the 1980s. And he helped the death squads who were responsible for killing social activists and 6 Jesuit priests, including Monsignor Oscar Romero, who was the archbishop who was shot in the chest by a death squad leader because he was opposed to the military junta and calling for a ceasefire. So who was Edmundo Gonzalez? Who is Maria Corina Machado briefly? How is this figure, how did this figure sort of wind up where he is that no one had heard of?
I'm willing to bet that it's still the same American figure that was coordinating with Edmundo Gonzalez back in the 1980s that's running U.S. policy right now in Venezuela, and that's Elliot Abrams. Elliot Abrams was overseeing the U.S.-backed dirty war in Central America throughout the 1980s at a time when Venezuela was, yes, allied with the U.S. in that extremely bloody and horrific battle. And Edmundo Gonzalez was working, as we just heard, in El Salvador at this time. And Elliot Abrams would go on to be convicted for lying to Congress over his role in Iran-Contra and get pardoned and wind up back in the Bush administration, the Bush II administration, in the National Security Cabinet of George W. Bush at the time when the U.S. backed another coup in Venezuela in 2002 that temporarily removed Chavez from office. It was reported in The Guardian that Elliot Abrams was the driving force behind the coup at that time. And we can only assume when Maria Corina Machado was welcomed in the Oval Office just a few years later in 2005, that Elliot Abrams was among the cast of characters in Washington that she got to know. And that was also around the time when USAID selected Maria Corina and her organization Sumate to receive funding US State Department funding because it was identified as one of the most effective grassroots, so-called grassroots organizations opposing Chavismo. And so Maria Corina Machado has had this financial relationship with the United States since basically the inception of Chavismo, since the early 2000s. And Elliot Abrams has been there every step of the way as well, not only in the Bush administration, but then working as Trump's Venezuela envoy, and is still in the Biden administration advising on Latin America policy. So the fact that they put a figure like Edmundo Gonzalez, who, as you say, is a lot like Biden, can barely speak and walk and doesn't really seem to know what's going on, suggests that, yes, there are bigger forces behind him running the show, just like with Biden. And it's not hard, once you look at his background, to identify who those figures could possibly be.
So the coup continues with different faces, but the same agenda. Here's someone frankly acknowledging that it was a coup.
I don't know that I agree with you, to be fair, with all due respect. One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work, and that's not what he did.
When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup, and you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
successful coups?
Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful. Not that we had all that much to do with it, but I saw what it took for an opposition to try and overturn an illegally elected president.
I don't know that I...
It's all fun and games. They're sitting right there in the Capitol Rotunda where the quote unquote insurrection took place and joking about planning coups abroad. John Bolton is a major figure in your book, Corporate Coup. John Bolton is someone that Nicolas Maduro, in my interview with him in Caracas, held personally responsible for attempting to assassinate him with drones in 2018, a plot that emanated from Colombia. Are we witnessing a coup again? I mean, it's supposed to be a presidential election. And what are your thoughts on the election, where it stands now? Is there any validity to this claim that the election was stolen?
Well, as I've explained many times, the Venezuelan election, the actual process, voting process, is very easy to audit because of the fact that you have to present a physical ID, scan your fingerprint, and that there's actually a physical receipt printed off the electronic vote that you make. And that physical tally is automatically audited against the electronic vote. The electronic voting machines are not connected to the internet, unlike in the United States. So there's not a lot of room for fraud. And the issue is here, according to Venezuela's constitution, they don't have the central election, the National Election Council doesn't have to publish the local polling data the night of the election. And because that didn't happen this time around, the next day, within hours, actually, really, Maria Corina Machado and the opposition came out with their claims of fraud in their own data that they presented online, which then the New York Times and mainstream corporate international media ran with. And institutions like the Carter Center, which in the past had been supportive and had praised Venezuela's election system, came out and were criticizing the government and asking for this local polling data. And so as the violence that we saw kind of kick off at the beginning of the week intensified, you had people shooting at National Guard troops and soldiers. It looked like the Guarimba riots that had broken out in Venezuela over the last, really since Maduro won his first election in 2014 or 13. Since those riots began, like every time there's an election, the opposition comes out and says that unless they win, they're pretty much going to hold the political system hostage. And that's what they began. That's the process they began earlier this week, shutting down roads. And this time around, it looks like that was all put to bed pretty quickly. The government made mass arrests, pretty much said that a lot of these people in the streets weren't even political. They were just violent criminal gangs that had been paid out to create chaos. And from what I've heard in Venezuela now, the streets are calm, streets have reopened, or stores have reopened, and there's not really a fear that those riots are going to get as intense as they were in previous years. And since the election, and since Machado and the opposition came out with all of their data, Maduro came out with his own response, which is to call on all of the political parties who participated in the Sunday election to submit their independent data to the Supreme Court. And that's because, you know, as part of this process that I described with the audit and the counting of the votes, every party sends officials that are present for the vote tally to, you know, observe it and collect data and have their own internal party data. And so because the opposition got out there ahead of the National Electoral Council with their data, Maduro's solution is to say, well, now his party and other opposition or supportive coalition parties are going to submit their numbers to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to hold an independent audit of the election. So things are kind of on hold. It's my feeling that Maduro will weather this storm just as he has all of the others that have been thrown at him over the last decade. And I would assume that Maria Corina Machado will either be in jail or Miami or Madrid by the end of the year, or within a few weeks, if not days.
Yeah, it really seems like all that the opposition has at this point is a media war, which it's waging through U.S. media and through private media across Latin America.
And Elon Musk.
Univision, we're going to get to Elon next. And they don't have the war in the streets that they had between 2014 and 2017. They don't even have what they had in 2018, 2019. So it does look, I mean, it does look from here like we could be heading just to 6 more years at least of Chavismo and intense US sanctions and so on. Elon Musk is a new figure who's entered the fray. Prior to this whole election, Elon Musk didn't say anything about Venezuela. And now he's the biggest loudmouth on the platform that he controls, and he's spreading the fakest of fake news. He's going nuts in support of Maria Corina Machado. These are some of Elon's tweets. I mean, I'll see if I can enlarge them, you know. And, you know, it'll always be like with Elon, it's like somebody will tweet something, oh, the protesters the Venezuelan people are rising up, the military is out to get Maduro, you know, just cranking up the mighty Wurlitzer, and he'll just be like, seems legit, or #1 in Venezuela. He doesn't seem very articulate. And here you can see he said, "This is real," referring to Bill Barr's Department of Justice issuing arrest warrant through the DEA for Nicolas Maduro, painting him as the leader of this giant imaginary cartel called Carteles del Sol. This is real, Elon says, because he acknowledges tacitly that he's been spreading so many fake videos and so much fake news. The real question that I think everyone wants to answer is, why is Elon doing this? And I have my theory that I'm hoping to substantiate in the near future, but I would like to hear yours.
Well, it's just pretty obvious that Venezuela is one of the, and probably you could even say the richest country in the world, between its oil and gold deposits and then all the other rare earth minerals. So it's pretty naked there that Elon has an interest. And other than that, I don't like to speculate too much. It's just, to me, it's so transparent that I don't really think we need to. And it's also just obvious he doesn't even know anything about Venezuela. Probably didn't even start thinking about it until this year. And the odd connection for me is also just this political network that he seems to back that is tied to Javier Milei. You can see on X, many of the main figures that are on Elon's platform have promoted Milei, and Elon himself went and signed some deals with the Argentine president there, who's pretty much handing his country over to foreign banksters and of the IMF. And Maria Corina Machado tweeted the night before the election that she'd had a conversation with Milei, and that was what prompted Elon to come out as an aggressive supporter for the Venezuelan opposition. It's funny to juxtapose Milei against Maduro, because people may be aware that part of the corporate coup launched against the Venezuelan state in 2019 was the decision from Britain to hold on to billions of dollars worth of Venezuela's gold bullion. And this was gold that had been stored years prior in London in the Bank of England's vaults that belonged to the sovereign government of Venezuela. What people may not realize is that in September of 2018, so this is months before the recognition of Guaido came down, and days, weeks before John Bolton and the United States attempted to assassinate Maduro, his government actually began the process of attempting to repatriate that gold, actually asked England to send that gold back to Venezuela, which is a very typical request that any sovereign state can make or should be able to. And it was only thanks to the rollout of this shadow coup government that London was able to say, oh, actually, we don't know who runs the Venezuelan government, so we have to sit on this gold indefinitely, conveniently at a time when London was facing a gold shortage. And Milei, meanwhile, comes into power claiming to be this, renegade libertarian who's really just a neoliberal globalist rebranded. I mean, libertarians in the US see what he's doing in terms of gutting the Argentine state, but that's not anything new in Latin America or the world. If you're running an IMF-backed government, that's not libertarian, that's neoliberal. If you're tying your currency to the dollar and letting foreigners come in and make decisions about your economy, I don't think you can be considered a libertarian. So Milei, in the last several weeks since taking office, has actually been shipping Argentina's sovereign gold supply abroad. And he actually tried to do this secretly without getting caught. And now he's trying to keep the destination secret. I'm willing to bet it's London. But I mean, this is why we have to really question this. I've seen figures describe the block that Elon represents as mainstream alternative media. I have to credit David Icke for coming up with that term, because he did, and I think it's a really accurate description of what we see with these people that claim to be, so chill and cool. And, Bari Weiss went down there and did a big puff piece on Milei.
Ben Shapiro.
Tucker did before he was elected. I would like to have maybe him speak to how he feels about Milei now on his own. But it's clear that Elon through Twitter is really boosting this phony libertarian model that is really just neoliberalism repackaged, and then cracking down and demonizing a leader that is actually trying to run a sovereign government. So why is that? I don't know. Whose interest does Elon really work for?
Here's a tweet by Eric Prince, who is basically running security along with Mahmoud Dahlan for the monarchy of the United Arab Emirates, which was supposed to be part of this giant NATO, Middle Eastern or Arab NATO that the US was trying to construct before October 7th just blew all that up. And the leadership in Gaza saw it coming. Sort of anti-Iran, anti-Palestinian NATO. And Eric Prince, former CEO of Blackwater, is very close to this Elon Musk kind of mainstream right Trumpist network. And he's getting in on the action. If he's constantly tweeting calls for, the arrest or assassination of Venezuela's leadership. If Kamala Harris and Joe Biden want to actually support freedom, and he capitalizes freedom. I don't know why these guys always capitalize random words. And legitimate elections in Venezuela, they should elevate the bounties to $100 million each on these wanted criminals, Nicolas Maduro and Diosdado Cabello, and all others in their cartel. then sit back and watch the magic happen. You can even pay these out from frozen regime money already in US banks. Yes, this sounds like a great idea. Eric Prince is obviously in on it. There's this whole network. And my theory, I mean, Eric Prince is just a businessman who uses private militias to advance his, basically recruits guys who have combat experience, special forces, killers from around the world to serve as a private militia for him so he can rustle up business on behalf of governments and money men. And it just seems like that these figures were all associated with one another, and they were part of a lobbying consortium, which probably started with Juan Guaido, and they gained some kind of access to Maria Corina, knowing she was next in line to run, and that she promised them something. Like, you talk about Citgo being sold off. There's PDVSA, wouldn't she want to give up the state oil company if she came into power? And then all these guys think they're going to get a cut.
I mean, I don't think we should speculate until there's evidence of any of that, because it's pretty obvious that they have interests, but we can't illustrate a plot at this moment clearly. But
I'm speculating, so that's what
I just don't like speculating, but that's just me.
Yeah.
So I would just note that on the Eric Prince tweet, he says, raise the bounty on this foreign leader and then let the magic happen. Interestingly enough, this week, the United States, for whatever reason, decided to move ahead and arrest Jordan Goudreau. You might remember was the leader of the Operation Gideon Bay of Piglets invasion. He's a former U.S. Green Beret who basically had some of his former teammates from the U.S. military go and train a group of Venezuelan military defectors in Colombia for a capture or kill mission in Venezuela targeting President Maduro because of those original bounties that were placed under the Trump administration. Those bounties came out, and then weeks later, Jordan Goudreau went ahead with this plan that was, harebrained and ridiculous. Anyone who knew anything about Venezuela could have told them what was going to happen, which was that his men got arrested. They're lucky they didn't get killed. I think it's only because Venezuela had intelligence that those American soldiers didn't die. And so that was the magic at play before. Eric Prince is basically saying, let's raise the stakes and try to get a more efficient operation that, again, I think would fail. And
he's basically saying, let me claim that money.
Yeah.
It's just not enough for me to send my guys in there.
He's saying, let somebody claim that money. But that's why the timing of Jordan Goudreau's arrest is so odd to me, because Jordan and his plot all came out in the spring of 2020, 4 years ago. Why is it that this week, when there are elections in Venezuela, when Eric Prince is out there cheerleading for a new mercenary invasion private intelligence op, why did they go and nab Jordan Goudreau, who was apparently so confident that he wasn't going to face charges in the United States, even though we already knew he was under investigation, that he was still in the United States? Unless they had some sort of freeze on his passport and he wasn't allowed to travel, which is possible. But the timing is still very, very strange to me. And so I hope to look into that. I just thought, wait, Eric Prince is out there basically saying we need to try this again. And there's all this drama going on in Venezuela. Why does the Justice Department now say, okay, let's round up Jordan Goudreau? Did he have information that they didn't want coming out? Is there some intrigue going on behind the scenes? Those are the questions that I have.
Well, I think it all comes back to the thesis of your book, Corporate Coup, which everyone watching this should buy to understand what's happening now in Venezuela. It's all about the Benjamins. That's why Elon's interested. And there's a network based on my informed speculation that seems to have been lobbying and getting, and I assume they got some kind of assurances. And what Eric Prince is saying in his tweet is, he's not going to say that unless he's in on it, unless there's something for him. Let's, before we move on from Venezuela, We actually did invite Jackson Hinkle onto this stream just because he is the target of calls from pretty high level figures for his kidnapping, his assassination. There's a lot of violence being carried out by the opposition hooligans in Venezuela's streets, and Jackson Hinkle, who's in Caracas, is a target. So we invited him on to hear his perspective. This is one of the, and that just killed our monetization, so I'll have to cut that out. I actually didn't mean to. I didn't mean to put the volume on there, but this is a video that Hinkle made, just showing all of the. That's Drew Pavlou, anti-Chinese psycho. All of these people are calling for.
Well, they didn't just call for him to be assassinated. They actually, what he's showing there is that they doxed him. They took photos and video that he posted on his Twitter account and then used geolocating to say where he was and tell people when there are armed criminal gangs roaming Venezuela's streets to go and find him. And Jackson told me this actually happened. He left his hotel after that came out, and then people were later had to evacuate because some suspicious people came to the hotel asking for him and were waiting in vehicles outside. So, I mean, I don't think it helps anyone to have Jackson detained there, except for people that want to silence him. He's obviously by far the most effective voice down there right now, countering this media war, especially because Elon has emerged as such a prominent voice playing against Venezuela at this time. Jackson has, led the charge in exposing the lies that Elon has put out there and helping, Jackson helped get this community note that revealed, and this is where I do give Elon credit, because even though he himself is not maybe the brightest bulb on the tree, he did put some features on X in this platform that now are even exposing him as a liar. So he thinks he owns the place, or that he gave us the tools where now he can kind of manipulate us. But, human beings, we're smarter than that. We actually were able to post on his lies community notes. And he got, I think, the biggest community note in the history of community notes on his lies about Venezuela. So, he can lie all he wants, but if his platform is going to be dedicated to the truth and free speech, he's only going to get called out for it. And Jackson, like I say, led the charge. And so that's why these forces are now attempting to dox him. And that's, sick. They're trying to actually they're putting his life in danger. I don't know if you want to pull up the latest Drew Pavlou tweet, where now they're spreading fake news rumors that actually Maduro has detained Jackson. They say that Maduro's government did this to protect him, but this is a lie. This is a complete phoniness. I'm talking to Jackson now. He's doing all right, not detained. So why are they spreading these rumors? And, they're even getting the U.S. government involved. So because this is all concerning a U.S. citizen in Venezuela. I just think that all of this drama and these attacks on Jackson are a testament to the power that he has on X and the voice that he has, which, has really been a boon to the truth.
He's definitely had the most reach of any Twitter account in English coming out of Venezuela, which is why he was targeted. We were targeted going into Bolivia to cover the election, which led to the election of Luis Arce over the coup regime there in a very similar fashion. You had ministers from the coup regime calling for us to be targeted, people following me on the plane during our connection, and Wyatt Reed got photographed. They were trying to dox us. It's a tactic of the U.S.-backed Latin American neoliberal right wing.
They're thugs,
and they're basically a bunch of, and as they would say in Mexico, they're run by a bunch of fresas who sit in air conditioned, securitized apartment towers all day, and they have thugs on the street that they just pay just to create chaos. That's what's going on in Venezuela, and those are the shock troops of empire from Caracas to. We'll talk about the thugs in quote unquote Israel in a minute, who are holding pro-rape insurrectionist riots at military bases. And they've got their thugs in the Donbass too, who sport Hitlerian insignia on their uniforms. These are the Imperial Shock Troops. And they're targeting Jackson Hinkle. They're also targeting average people in the street. And I won't show the scenes of the gore of Chavistas being targeted, as Sandinistas were in the U.S. government-sponsored 2018 coup in Nicaragua. Where just average people who happen to be of the wrong political persuasion are being massacred. And I think that's, or brutalized and tortured. And I think that's what you would see if Maria Corina came in, is these kind of purges backed fully by the US government. And you'd see the State Department just kind of shrugging the way they shrug about the hideous violence directed at Palestinians by their mad dog on the leash or off the leash in the Middle East. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Anya. I want to move regions now.
Sure. Yeah. I think that the Venezuelans have faced down another attempt to violently overthrow their government. I think the momentum has been taken out of the opposition. And I guess we should all place bets on whether or not Maria Corina Machado will end up in Miami or a prison cell. But there are a lot of other countries where I'll say she wouldn't have even gotten this far, considering her deep ties to the United States. Like, just there are receipts that we have, even that I have just as a journalist, thanks to WikiLeaks. I can only imagine what the Venezuelan government has, proving that she's a foreign agent. So the fact that she was able to run this campaign to begin with and just openly out in the public this way is something that might not have been allowed in a lot of other countries.
Definitely. So buy the book, Corporate Coup. This is it at Or Books.
As much as I want a great Amazon rating, I would prefer that you buy it from my publisher. But if you do it from Amazon, that helps me too.
And this sets the stage for what's happening. So we don't have any other way of getting you the book. But I want our audience to understand what's happening in Venezuela as part of, I know there are a lot of people who have been watching us, came on as Grayzone fans or watchers, part of our audience since October 7th, because we've been focusing a lot on Palestine. But you have to understand Venezuela as part of the larger program that's also dedicated to snuffing out Palestine as a political project. It's the larger project that's also dedicated to balkanizing Russia and to eliminating any threat to American hegemony. And it's why the de facto Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, has pledged total support to Israel, as all the US-backed opposition figures, including Zelensky,
and Javier Milei.
And Javier Milei worships at the court of Benjamin Netanyahu. Yeah. So you have to see this all as one program.
Elon
Musk was present with Netanyahu at his repugnant address in the US Capitol. So this is all one imperial program dedicated to Zionism and capital and US hegemony.
And let me the last thing I'll say on that, since you brought up the wider global context for Venezuela, there are Russian advisors and military hardware present in Venezuela. The Venezuelans have close ties to Iran, have military equipment that they've also purchased from Iran. The allies across the globe in these various battles are the same. Iran and Russia on the side of the resistance axis in Palestine, Russia and Iran on the same side in Ukraine, where Iran has even provided military support to Russia, and also here in Venezuela. So this is, if it escalates and there is a regional war, which I don't think it'll get to that point, and I hope it doesn't, it is part of a global world war. And maybe 10 years from now, we will start to understand what is happening right now in that way. 10 years from now, when Russia, Iran, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, and China, and India, and Venezuela, and all of the major oil producers and all of the rising economies and all of the primary oil consumers are functioning in this new world that they're crafting without the West, we'll be sitting here in the US and Europe like, oh, that's what that war was about. We lost because we were stupid. We were just idiotic working against our own interests this whole time. Geez.
Yeah, I think we're at that moment, and we're going to talk about that next. Anya Parampil, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a marathon for you all week, and the marathon will continue afterwards, but it's important to have this perspective out there. Once again, the book is Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire. Thanks a lot, Anya.
Thanks, Matt.
I'll see you. I'll see you when I walk upstairs.
Okay, yeah, sounds like a plan.
All right. So it's the Grayzone live. We're going to bring in Aaron Mate now to talk about the looming world war that we could be facing as Aaron adjusts his wiring. Someone commented that me and Anya pretend not to be married when we're doing these interviews, but that's kind of like the way we talk in general. So sorry, it's not an act. I don't know if other people would want that kind of relationship, but definitely it keeps me balanced. So I want to talk about, we have so much to get through, but I want to kind of set the stage for where we're currently at, which is awaiting an Iranian counterattack. That will likely be a joint attack comprising the three main elements of the axis of resistance, not just Iran, but Ansar Allah, the de facto government of Yemen, the Houthis, as well as Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. This could happen at any minute, or it could happen at an unexpected time, but it seems very, very likely to happen. But what's been happening inside Israel really set the stage for this moment. And I think, Aaron, we should start with the pro-rape riots that took place inside Israel. And I don't know if you want to comment before we get to this on just the irony of this happening, given what we've been going through at the Grayzone, all the attacks we've been facing for exposing the hoax of systemic rape by Hamas on October 7th.
Well, it's clear now, as it always has been from the start, what the point of these allegations of Hamas sexual violence on October 7th were about. They were about painting Hamas as this ghoulish entity that can't be negotiated with, that has to be eliminated. And by de facto, and by implication, all the Palestinians around them have to be eliminated too, because Hamas just can't exist because they were guilty, Israel said, of sexual violence on a systemic level on October 7th. As we pointed out from the start, it was a lie. There's not evidence for actually a single case of sexual assault on October 7th, let alone on a mass scale. And for questioning that propaganda, we were, dismissed as rape apologists and attacked and all that stuff like that. But really, it's not just about manufacturing consent for mass murder. This is also about projecting what Israel is about, because right now in Israel, we've seen riots this week of people demanding the right of Israeli forces to rape and sexually assault Palestinian prisoners. When some Israeli soldiers were detained for allegations of sexual assault and rape, the base where they were held, or the facility where they were held, was confronted by a mass of protesters demanding that they be freed. And this was at the same time the Israeli Knesset was having a debate on whether or not it's okay to sexually assault Palestinian prisoners. So all this is not just this allegation against Hamas was not just about manufacturing consent for the mass murder campaign in Gaza. It was a projection. It was Israel projecting onto its foes what it actually does out in the open and insists on the right to do. And it's just it underscores it's a sick society, which comes out of being founded on ethnic cleansing and occupation. To sustain, yourself as a colonizing force, you have to turn the people you're colonizing into subhumans, just as the Nazis did to the Jews. And when you do that, you can justify doing anything to them. and you're indignant when anybody dares question your right to do it. So that's what we're seeing unfold in Israel right now.
Yeah. We were witnessing the unraveling of a psychotic cult. And it took place, one of the pivotal moments that I think is leading not just away from a two-state solution or towards a one-state solution, but towards a no-state solution, was the riots at the Beit Lid military base. These are like led by fanatical settlers. So, you know, Israel, the military is the most revered institution in Israel. Israel is an army without it's an army with a state. The army has always traditionally led the state. In the past, prior to Netanyahu, every leader had come out of the army. Yitzhak Rabin, Ehud Barak, all of the major figures were highly decorated officers. And now you have someone who's not really known for his military service, who's being controlled by the Kahanist Messianic right of Itamar Ben-Gvir, also someone who has very little distinction in the military. He's a lawyer for the most rabid, violent settlers. That's how he gained his distinction in Israel. And they are raiding military bases because the military, the Israeli military, under pressure from the International Criminal Court, and I would assume the Biden administration, wanted to demonstrate that it could regulate its own, that it could punish its own, and that the Biden administration could keep calling for Israeli investigations of Israeli war crimes in the face of clear, undeniable, documented beyond debate evidence that Israel's Force 100, a shadowy unit that controls the Sde Teman concentration camp that was set up for men kidnapped from Gaza after October 7th, had been conducting using rape, sexually assaulting male prisoners. It was leaking out into the New York Times, of course, not through front page features like their phony debunked screams before silence or screams without words feature, but it was featured in New York Times articles about electric rods being inserted in men being sodomized. And now you have a soldier from Force 100 who participated in the gang rape of a Palestinian prisoner. Israel arrested this soldier and several other Force 100 members, and they were basically broken out of this military base, which held a military court, by the followers of Itamar Ben-Gvir, but not just Ben-Gvir. Also, the Israeli justice minister called for their release. The Israeli minister after minister, down to Israel's president, Isaac Herzog from the Labor Party, who's supposed to be the nice, enlightened guy in Israel's government, has called for their prosecution to end. And what you're seeing here, what you're seeing in scenes like this, is really the future of Israel. It's the real Israel that will be in control after Netanyahu. I'm having trouble accessing one tweet which shows these riots, but anyone can just take a look at the riots that took place. Well, this is them breaking in to the court. I mean, these are scenes like January 6th, but they're much more significant because no one's being punished here. And there's a clear call to overthrow the army leadership. They're not protesting a stolen election. They're protesting soldiers being punished for raping non-Jews. And so we can clearly see what the future of Israel is all about, but also how unstable Israel is, because this all occurred after an incident we'll get into next of a missile striking Majdal Shams in occupied Syrian territory in the Golan Heights, Israeli occupied Syrian territory. And it actually postponed Israel's preparation to attack Hezbollah and initiate a wider campaign against southern Lebanon because the security risk to Israel from the future of Israel's political class was so severe, and the military was so threatened by these pro-rape insurrectionist riots. And so we see Zionism eating itself alive. There's nothing to say about this except that this emanates from the ideology of Zionism, which preaches that Jews are fundamentally superior to everyone else in historic Palestine, if not the world, and that their lives are the only lives that matter. What kind of leadership do you expect to rise with such an overarching ideology dominating every institution of Israeli life?
Yeah, and that they have a divine claim to the land, that God promised it to them, so therefore they can take any measure possible to expand their control of it. I mean, it's straight up religious fundamentalism, and it's all the more dangerous because we're not just talking about a fringe movement. This is now basically the mainstream of society at the highest levels of government. And as I said recently when I was on Piers Morgan debating to Zionist propagandists, this is a society that needs to be de-radicalized. I mean, for its own sake, but for the world's sake too, because they have nuclear weapons. I mean, like, there's no movement that is where radicalization is as mainstream and powerful as Zionism right now. It's not even close. I mean, there are a lot of Christian fundamentalists in power in the US, but in terms of like the level of extremism and the threat they pose to not just the region, but the world, Israel is just far in the lead. And so how will they be de-radicalized? I don't know the answer, but they need to be for everyone's sake.
And therefore they need to be demilitarized, because the radicalism emerges from the military, but it also emerges from the messianic institutions, which are seeking control. You can see they're trying to take control over the military through this incident, and it won't be the end. This incident is a harbinger of what is to come if and when there is a ceasefire. And it's why I think there cannot be a real ceasefire, because Netanyahu sees the writing on the wall. Netanyahu, in a way, is rational. He's messianic because he has to appeal to the messianic future of Israel. And in a way, he's sort of personally messianic because he has narcissistic personality disorder. He's willing to lie, and maybe he believes his lies to some extent, but he also understands what kind of danger, not just he, but the state of Israel as a putative Jewish and democratic state is in. Once there's a ceasefire, if there's a ceasefire, those elements are going to go crazy across the state. They're going to rampage, and there will be a civil war. And if anyone attempts to take Netanyahu's place, like Benny Gantz, they will be basically a US-backed regime that will have no support from the streets, and especially from the settlements, who really are the most dynamic and violent political force in Israel. So we're just witnessing a microcosm of what's to come if there's a ceasefire. That's why Netanyahu has actually said we need to live life on the sword, something that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the fanatics in his coalition, are eager to enjoy. And, Christian Zionists call it the Battle of Gog and Magog. They think this is revelation. So there are a lot of people pushing for sort of permanent war. And then like, look at how this incident is being played, is playing out in Israeli media. The wife of the rapist Israeli soldier has come out and said that she basically celebrates what her husband did. The wife of one of the suspects of abusing a terrorist. This is a murderer. What do I care about his ass? I see the cry of the fighters, and that's what I'm looking at. She said that both she and her husband feel threatened and stated it's nothing. It's about politics. So she's standing by her man after her man sodomized another man who is a defenseless prisoner. How many women would do that if they, I understand, you stand by your man because everybody has problems in their marriage. They have an affair. Not everybody goes out and rapes male prisoners and then brags about it and celebrates it, has people riot in their defense, and you stand by him. You have to be so far gone and so psychotic and so indoctrinated to think that. And this is the future of Israel.
And, you know, this dynamic you're talking about, where basically Israel's become so extreme that an internal strife is inevitable. It's not even that new, because look what happened to Yitzhak Rabin back in the 1990s. He was assassinated by an extremist settler who was ginned up by people like Benjamin Netanyahu, because the Netanyahu camp felt as if Rabin was giving away too much land to the Palestinians as part of the fake Oslo peace process, when in reality, the Oslo peace process was actually just a excuse or a ruse to take over more Palestinian land, giving them some scraps and pretending as if that's a Palestinian state. But for extremist Israelis, even that act was too much. It was too much of a surrender to Palestinians. So they killed Yitzhak Rabin over it. So even someone like Yitzhak Rabin, who was serving the process of colonization, the country was so, this is 30 years ago now. The country was so extreme that even he was killed. And Yitzhak Rabin's wife blamed Netanyahu for his murder. So this is a process that's been going on for a very, very long time.
This is a Netanyahu marching in front of a mock coffin for Yitzhak Rabin during a rally against the Oslo Accords. And as you said, he was heavily involved in inciting Rabin's killing. Netanyahu has always used assassination as a political tool. It's one of the main tools in his toolbox, along with the state of Israel, even killing his Jewish rivals who are no friends of Palestinians.
I mean, like right before Rabin was killed, he gave a speech saying that, you know, there will never be a Palestinian state. We're just doing this so we can basically get the Palestinian Authority to handle security for us. And we're going to keep the major settlement blocks. And if we give Palestinians limited autonomy, we're not going to have to worry about human rights groups complaining about our abuse of Palestinians. So Rabin was basically advancing a neo-colonial project, but the country is so extreme they couldn't even tolerate that, because they wanted to basically have full control over every square inch of land, not even grant Palestinians some nominal control in a small slice of territory.
And so here we are again with Israel destabilized in the wake of pro-rape riots. Any solution to the Palestinian issue through diplomatic or political means has been taken off the table. And the trigger point for what appears to be a looming attack, counterattack by Iran and its allies in Lebanon and Yemen, was a missile strike on a town called Majdal Shams in the Golan Heights, which is occupied territory. It's Syrian territory, where the inhabitants are actually Syrian and have no love for Israel or Netanyahu. And Israel really has no love for them. It's mistreated and abused them ever since it took this territory in 1967, depriving them of water, depriving them of basic rights, while feigning, now Israel's feigning concern because 11 children were killed on a soccer pitch and many were injured by a missile. So where did the missile come from? Israel is claiming that this was a Hezbollah rocket. The model of rocket that they claim struck this soccer pitch has a range of about 10 kilometers, but the soccer pitch was 12 kilometers from the Lebanese border. And there is some significant evidence that the missile may have been a misfired Israeli Iron Dome missile, which we've seen. We've seen Iron Dome misfires in March, which struck targets in the very same area, and we've also seen them come down. Patriot batteries, other anti-missile systems misfire in Ukraine, killing large numbers of Ukrainian civilians, whether it was in Dnipro last year or this year against a hospital, which was blamed on Russia or Russian missiles. So this is not something that's completely out of the ordinary. Here are some eyewitnesses from the town describing that scenario. First, I point out a state of uncertainty. They do not accept the claims of the Israeli army, a reporter saying. Residents, an Israeli paramedic wearing a red Star of David shirt, Magen David, told me he heard from the eyewitnesses at the scene that the rocket that fell was an Iron Dome missile But he did not dare record this interview. I asked him for an interview to document this testimony, but he said he would be jailed if he gave such statements or information. This is one of the testimonies present around Majdal Shams. We're now around the stadium where this rocket fell. There is a state of uncertainty. Some said what we see now is Mount Hermon. Some said they saw a rocket fired from the Iron Dome from Mount Hermon falling towards this stadium. This is a testimony I heard moments ago from eyewitnesses, but they did not dare to record such testimony. Therefore, regardless of what the Israeli occupation army claims, there is a state of uncertainty. There's a lack of trust in what the Israeli army says. And it is true that you can be jailed now under Israeli law for interfering with or insulting the army's efforts in its post-October 7th war, and hundreds of Palestinian citizens of Israel have been jailed for mere Facebook posts. So that the fear there is understandable. But you're also seeing possibly a major deception unfold. Because as I said, this was a major trigger point. Netanyahu feigning concern for the children who were killed, as though Netanyahu cares about dead Arab children, attempted to make a propaganda trip to Majdal Shams. And here's how he was received. The residents were not happy to see him there. And it kind of reminds me of Donald Trump attempting to wave a Bible at a church that had been burned by BLM rioters in Washington, D.C., pushing his way through what were, at that point, peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters, and the following day in Washington, D.C., with tear gassing the entire area, because that's pretty much what Netanyahu had to do to be able to lay a wreath at these children's graves or to make condolences for them. But this was all part of a PR stunt in which Israel sought to gain the moral legitimacy in order to begin to retaliate against Hezbollah. And what followed next was the assassination of a top Hezbollah commander who was in the Jihad Council, close to Hassan Nasrallah, a major crossing of a red line. Like before they were taking out field commanders, now they're taking out a major political figure in Hezbollah. And next, the killing of Ismail Haniyeh. Any thoughts on this incident so far?
The idea that this was Hezbollah that carried out that missile strike is just hard to believe. Amal Saad, who's a specialist on Hezbollah, she pointed out that Hezbollah's refrained for a long time from targeting civilians, especially since October 7th. I mean, they focus on Israeli military sites. They've also been putting out all these drone videos basically as a warning to Israel that if it escalates, it can hit Israeli military sites. So why, after putting out these warning videos, would Hezbollah go ahead and attack a civilian site, especially in Israeli-occupied Syrian territory? It just doesn't make any sense. At worst, I think if this were Hezbollah, I don't think it was Hezbollah, but at worst, if it were, it would have to have been an accident. There's no way they deliberately targeted a civilian site. But I tend to believe the idea that this was a misfired Israeli missile. But of course, I can't say for sure without any kind of investigation. And look, Israel has a history of this. They start all their wars going back to their founding. 1967, they attacked all their neighbors first and claimed it was preemptive, even though they knew that it wasn't. They knew that Egypt was not going to attack them. The only reason Egypt had mobilized forces on its borders was to deter Israel from attacking Syria, because Israel had been shelling Syria for a long time. And finally, Israel got the war that it wanted, and that's why it occupied the Syrian Golan Heights, among other territory that it wanted. 1982, before it invaded Lebanon, Israel was shelling Lebanon for more than a year, trying to provoke a reaction from the PLO. And finally, they got one missile in response, and then they used that, among other fake pretexts, to invade Lebanon and kill tens of thousands of people. So, and the 2008, the day that Barack Obama is elected, Israel breaks the ceasefire with Hamas and starts a whole new operation that kills, well over 1,000 people in Gaza. So there's a long record of Israel doing this. I would not be surprised if this is just the latest in that lineage.
And in 2006, when Hezbollah accidentally struck an area very close to Majdal Shams during the Israeli aggression in southern Lebanon, they caused some casualties among civilians. They acknowledged fault and apologized because they wanted to be taken seriously and be seen as credible whenever they did not carry out a strike and were falsely blamed for it by Israel. Israel, which was responsible in Beirut throughout the civil war in the 1980s, according to Israeli correspondent Ronen Bergman in his book, Rise Up and Kill, Israel created a fake terrorist group in Beirut run by the Mossad, which carried out terrorist bombings to kill civilians, which they then blamed on the PLO in order to escalate that conflict. It's all right there in a book that's endorsed, blurbed by the former heads of the Mossad, including Tamir Pardo. So this is perfectly within Israel's MO. Netanyahu wanted to paper over Israel's internal crises. He needed to postpone sabotage a ceasefire, which would have resulted in political catastrophe in Gaza, a ceasefire with the factions in Gaza, which would have resulted in catastrophe for him. His speech in Washington was all about that, and they needed to escalate. And so you have this incident as the pivot point. I don't know. Will we look back someday at this incident as akin to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, something that unleashed a kind of global war? Not sure, but it looks like we're heading towards regional war. And the next thing that Israel did was assassinate Ismail Haniyeh after killing Fuad Shukr, someone violating a major red line for Hezbollah. They kill Ismail Haniyeh in North Tehran. Absolute insanity. I mean, in my view. But the objective was clear, because Haniyeh had taken over the portfolio for negotiations, and he was a politician. He was not someone in the Al-Qassam brigades who had a role in planning the October 7th attacks. It's very likely that those attacks came as a surprise to him. He's politically representing Hamas out of Doha. He went to Tehran to participate in the inauguration of the new Iranian president, which was another part of another aspect that inspired Israel's blood-stained gambit, was to undercut a reformist Iranian president. And hours after participating in the inauguration, he's killed through means that are still not well understood. Ronen Bergman, who I mentioned before, he's now a New York Times correspondent. He put forward the Mossad line, which is, that allows the Mossad to continue to operate in the shadows and officially deny having any role in the attack, which is that Haniyeh was killed by a bomb that had been planted months before in the guest suite of his hotel, which was run by the IRGC. But Fars News, which is an official news organ of the Iranian government, states that Haniyeh was assassinated by a kind of projectile or a shell that hit his residence, destroying part of its roof and windows, and that Israel was clearly responsible. This is a video of Haniyeh returning to Doha, and he was buried earlier today. I think, yeah, Aaron, any thoughts?
Well, I mean, as you pointed out, I mean, this is a murder of someone who was the top Hamas official engaged in negotiations to free the Israeli captives, underscoring that Netanyahu not only doesn't care about, obviously, Palestinian civilians and wants to continue killing them, but doesn't care about his own captives. He's willing to let them all die in order to continue his goal of destroying Gaza and making it uninhabitable for the people there. I mean, that's obvious. But it's not even just about killing someone who's involved in these short-term negotiations over, ceasefire and captive release, captive exchange. Haniyeh also is a moderate compared to Netanyahu or anybody else in the Israeli government, and in fact, anybody else in the U.S. government for that matter, because he has long called for political negotiations, not just over a ceasefire, but he said before, as other top Hamas leaders have, and there's a split within Hamas over this, but he represents the moderate faction. He's called for a two-state solution, which for Palestinians is an unbelievable compromise. That's accepting 22% of their historic homeland, a state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. He's endorsed that before, along with some other people in Hamas. And rather than engage with that overture, which for, again, any Palestinian is a huge compromise, Israel has rejected it, refused to negotiate with Hamas, fully backed by the U.S. in this. They joined with Israel in putting Gaza under siege, going back now more than 2 decades. And now they kill him. So what they're also saying is, on top of no negotiations over a ceasefire or hostage release, but no negotiations over what the U.S. says is its ultimate goal, which is a path to a Palestinian state. What they're actually saying is, by doing this, not just Israel, but the U.S. by backing him, is they don't care about any of that stuff. And they do not want a political resolution to this. As you were saying earlier, Max, their only language is force. And so that's what that's the only path they're putting us on, is that this gets resolved through years and years more of violence. And whether we all survive that, is an open question, because it's just so dangerous. But that's the only path that the U.S. and Israel are putting us on, because they refuse to even accept a Palestinian surrender, a huge compromise that even some people in Hamas were willing to make. And now the leading figure who represented that sort of moderate voice has been killed.
As his the previous lead negotiator for Hamas in ceasefire negotiations, Salah Arori, who founded Hamas's branch in the West Bank, where he was from and was in exile in Beirut, was also assassinated by Israel. So they're killing all the negotiators they can, but they've done it in Iranian territory. And this has had a profound effect, I think, on not just the politics, but the culture of the Middle East in a way that does not benefit Israel. Let's take a look at the procession in Iran for Haniyeh.
یعقوب فقط یه پسر از دست داده بود پسرشم زنده بود و انا رأیت ابی و جماعت اهل بیتی یذبحون حولی ولی من دیدم بابای غریبم برادرم عموی نازنینم همه کنار من
Okay. Funerals and funeral processions, observances for people who are considered saintly they have a very emotional core role in a society like Iran that is Shia. And here are thousands and thousands of Shia men paying respect, paying homage to a Sunni leader, the leader of a Sunni resistance group in Tehran. So a Sunni leader is being mourned in Tehran. Remember, the United States under Donald Trump, under pressure from Netanyahu and Netanyahu's rent boy, Mike Pompeo, ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, a Shia leader, the second most influential political figure in Iran, a veteran. I think he was a colonel in the Iranian military of the Iran-Iraq war. They assassinated him in Baghdad, which led to processions in his honor in Iraq, kind of putting to bed in many ways the historic hatred between Iraq and Iran. And Soleimani was on his way to a peace conference to deal with Saudi Arabia to put aside that enmity. And so once again, Israel, this mad dog, is uniting people across the region, across the sectarian divide that the US and Israel and the West needed to exploit in Syria and successfully exploited in Syria to drive hundreds of thousands of deaths through their dirty war. It brings us back to the period after Hezbollah's moral victory over Israel in 2006, when the Sunni Arab world had been united behind it before Hezbollah was forced to enter the Syrian conflict. But I think the emotional impact of these killings is much stronger at this point. I think the region is much more united now against Israel and the US, including in de facto US colonies like Jordan, including among previously pro-US the liberal intelligentsia in Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and places like that. They're disgusted by this. And I don't think the US, the Biden administration, understands what has been done here and how damaging this is to their own interests. And clearly, I don't think the Israelis understand what they've done here, because Iran is a cradle of human civilization. It's not a country that worries about the next 5 months the way Israel does, or can't even plan for another year. It's a country whose leadership sees things on a much longer historical arc. And Israel will always be facing, as long as it needs to be an exclusivist Jewish state, its demographic crisis. So whatever happens with Iran's counterattack and the counterattack of its allies, the crisis that Israel faces will continue to accelerate while they have united those they consider their enemies. All of this could have been avoided, all of it, if the Biden administration had just decided to impose a ceasefire. And there are many points and they could have done so. But now what are they doing, Aaron? They're rushing troops to the region.
Yeah, so this is the statement that the Biden administration put out, like a readout of Biden's call with Netanyahu on Thursday. It's hard for people to read it on the screen, but basically the most glaring thing about that statement is what it omits. It doesn't even mention a ceasefire, which Biden has said is his ultimate goal. No, he doesn't even mention it. And he talks about the U.S. commitment to Israel's security against all threats from Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, which it says are all just proxies of Iran. And then he talks about supporting Israel with, quote, new defensive U.S. military deployments. So does that mean that Biden's sending more troops on Israel's behalf? That's what it reads like. And after that, then they got this planted in Axios, and Barak Ravid, who's an Israeli reporter who just parrots whatever he's told. And we've gotten this story so many times. It's comical at this point that they're still attempting to put this out, that Biden demanded in a tough call that Netanyahu stop escalating tensions in the region and move immediately toward a Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal, U.S. officials said. Well, they didn't mention that in their readout of the call, so why should we believe that he did that now by planting this with a reliable stenographer in the media? And what evidence is there that there's any pressure at all on Netanyahu, especially after he just got this rapturous welcome in D.C. just over a week ago? So Biden's backing Israel fully, as he always has, and as he promised to do. I mean, Biden is so unbelievably dangerous. I want to play this statement. This is back in October, just a few weeks after October 7th, and Biden was bragging that basically that the U.S. can fuel wars everywhere, not just in Ukraine, but in Israel, Palestine as well.
Ukraine more than the United States can take on at the same time. Are the wars in Israel and Ukraine more than the United States can take on at the same time?
We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world. We can take care of both of these and still maintain our overall international defense. We have the capacity to do this, and we have an obligation to. We are the essential nation, as to paraphrase the former Secretary of State. And if we don't, who does?
I mean, what an insane statement. Like, rather than saying we're going to bring these wars to an end because we want to have peace in the world, he's bragging at his ability to fuel two wars at the same time, and he's indignant at the suggestion that he can't. That's how much of a warmonger he is, and he's stayed true to that commitment because he has fueled these two disastrous wars, and he still is today. I mean, that's who Biden is, and he's made good on that promise.
Well, we're America. He always says we're America, and it's almost as though he doesn't have any analysis of what America is at this point. We can do anything.
By the way, in that same interview, he also endorsed Netanyahu's goal of eliminating Hamas, which means that, like, he totally tethered himself to Netanyahu's objectives, which makes it impossible for him, even if he wanted to walk anything back, because he endorsed Netanyahu's call for destroying Hamas. Of course, that's not going well at all. Hamas is very much still intact. What's been destroyed is Gaza, and that's what Biden's continuing to facilitate.
Yeah, that's official administration policy and has been since the bear hug on October 10th, I guess, of Netanyahu. Netanyahu demanded that as official policy. The State Department still advances it as official policy, and it's a regime change policy that the U.S. reflexively reaches for when it has failed in every single instance since Yugoslavia and produced this backlash against the U.S. along with a lot of instability. It's part of Biden's sort of, it's sort of a reflexive psychological twitch for Biden to support regime change. And what's happening? I mean, Biden's, they're lightening up his schedule. They're reducing his cognitive enhancement drugs. He doesn't have to do it anymore. Kamala's everywhere. Watch this scene from Biden and was there to greet Evan Gershkovich and the other former prisoners in Russia on the tarmac in Washington last night. And just look at the optics here. He's there with Kamala, who wouldn't have been there otherwise. They're kind of putting her forward as the next president. She's wearing a dark suit. She's looking serious. And Biden actually gets asked towards the end about the assassination of Haniyeh and the potential for a ceasefire. I'll replay that.
I'm very concerned about it. I had a very direct meeting with Prime Minister today.
She's saying you're not worried about the looming war and the stopping a ceasefire. And he said, I had a very direct meeting with Netanyahu today, which echoes the story planted with Barak Ravid and Axios.
Very direct. We have the basis for a ceasefire. He should move on it, and they should move on it now.
Okay, so totally delusional. We have the basis for a ceasefire. He should move on it. So he calls for a ceasefire. This is after allowing Israel to assassinate Haniyeh in Iran. Don't tell me they didn't know. Okay, but he gets a follow-up question.
Pardon me? It's not helped.
The assassination, how is that, played into the ceasefire, he's asked. And he says it's not helped, and then he walks away. So he acknowledges that that Netanyahu is working counter to U.S. interests. The U.S. would like some form of ceasefire, obviously on Israel's terms. They're acting as Israel's lawyer, but they're allowing Israel to just run rampant. Biden acknowledges that it hasn't helped, and yet he does nothing, exerts no leverage, acts like Netanyahu is the superpower, as he always has. And Kamala's right there. She's a completely callow figure who is going to offer nothing different. Mark my words. And one of the reasons why is because Netanyahu does have behind this assassination an objective that pertains to U.S. politics as well. And it's a continuation of the strategy he put forward during his speech at the U.S. Capitol last week, which is to divide the country, to play on divisions in the U.S., continue to shift the Overton window to Israel and the Likudnik right, and make life so uncomfortable for Kamala that she's constantly asked, do you support Israel assassinating this figure? Do you support Israel's war with Hezbollah, the terrorists in Lebanon? Do you support Israel on all these issues? And she has to keep saying yes, 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 even if it goes against US interests, and which will weaken her among her own base. But at the same time, she has to cater to the donor class, the Zionist billionaire class that is kicking in a substantial portion of money to the to the Harris campaign coffers now, which is another reason why she's going to consider Joshua Shapiro as her vice president. So there's a ricochet effect here with all these assassinations and all the insanity that Israel's unleashing, which is to weaken Kamala because Netanyahu is banking on a Trump victory. And Kamala had some interesting remarks, some really articulate remarks there on the tarmac, by the way, which we have somewhere in our notes.
I got him. So we're moving on now to, are we?
Well, let's just hear what Kamala had to say about this whole situation.
Okay. So it's really profound. This is, if you haven't seen this, everybody, prepare to have your mind blown.
This is just an extraordinary testament to the importance of having a president who understands the power of diplomacy and understands the strength that rests in understanding the significance of diplomacy and strengthening alliances. This is an incredible day.
Let's hear that again for anyone, because it's such a profound statement. It might be hard to fully grasp it. So let's hear that one more time.
This is just an extraordinary testament to the importance of having a president who understands the power of diplomacy and understands the strength that rests in understanding the significance of diplomacy and strengthening alliances. This is an incredible day.
So that's the person who's supposed to stand up to Netanyahu. And this was her big moment too, to show her diplomatic chops. And she produces another blooper reel for RNC Research. I mean, one of the best comedy accounts on Twitter is RNC Research, because we had Biden just flowing into this complete moron. I mean, she's completely hollow. She in a lot of ways, she's Reagan-esque, because she's basically an actor who is just spouting lines that are fed to her, except she's not as convincing as Reagan. She's certainly not as convincing as Obama. So I think just based on what I'm seeing, Netanyahu's strategy, at least in the U.S., is working. We'll see who she picks for VP. If we have time, we'll talk about Joshua Shapiro. But I think, any final thoughts or further thoughts on the looming Iranian counterattack and Israel's mad dog behavior in the region, Aaron?
Well, I'm just assuming that Netanyahu went into this thinking he'd have U.S. backing for any further escalation with Iran and Hezbollah, and it looks like he has it. I mean, Biden talked about sending more troops to the Middle East, and Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, said that we will defend Israel. So now we just wait to see how Iran and its allies respond, and pray that this doesn't get any worse, on top of the mass murder campaign that's now in its 300th day. It's and we're in this position because of the joint U.S.-Israeli commitment to violence, to destroying Gaza, rather than engaging with all the diplomatic opportunities that have been available to them.
Agree. And I think how they respond, how Iran and its allies respond, we don't know. The most the money's on a massive drone swarm, much larger than the one that was the response to Israel's brazen attack on Iran's consular facilities in Damascus, followed by a much larger storm of ballistic missiles. And what Israeli sources close to the Netanyahu's national security cabinet are saying through Israeli Channel 12 is that if Iran merely strikes military targets or civilian targets, but not killing large numbers of civilians, then Israel will sort of seek to manage its response, do damage control. But if there are large numbers of civilian deaths, then Israel kind of goes crazy and demands that the U.S. defend it against after the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust, which will be their line. And everyone will forget why a counterattack had actually struck Israel. It'll just be an attack. It'll just be a new Holocaust. That's sort of the line from Israel. So the question is, can Iran thread the needle? Does it even want to thread the needle? And if it's not going to thread the needle, then yes, we'll be in regional war. It will be a regional war for a long time. And I don't think Israel is going to do very well under a long-term regional war. It just doesn't have the kind of society that can withstand something like that. So we'll continue to report what we see, inform, educate where we can. We'll move on now, I guess, to Gerskovich, the largest prisoner swap since the Cold War between the U.S. and Russia. Aaron, I don't know if you want to intro this or.
Well, in a rare sign of diplomacy, the U.S. and Russia and other states have conducted a massive prisoner swap. And the most high profile on the U.S. side is Evan Gershkovich, a Wall Street Journal reporter who was charged with basically espionage inside Russia. And there's been a very vocal campaign to free him. And Russia, its most prominent captive that it got back was an assassin who was convicted of killing a Chechen militant in Germany a few years ago. And look, just broadly, any act of diplomacy between the U.S. and Russia, I think, is a good thing. It's something to welcome. It shows that the sides can talk and reach solutions when they engage with it. And that's a contrast to the Biden administration's policy of not engaging in diplomacy with Russia ever since the start of the Russian invasion phase of the Ukraine war, even though, of course, the Ukraine war has been going on for 10 years. After Russia invaded, the Biden administration, rather than engage in diplomacy with Russia, basically refused to talk to Russia because they wanted to seize the opportunity to lock Russia into a quagmire, which has resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, multiple peace opportunities blocked by the U.S., and Russia now controlling 1/5 of Ukraine's territory and taking up even more. So I hope that this prisoner exchange creates the space for further negotiations, because there's no reason why this war in Ukraine should continue. Unless Russia is so fed up with talking with the U.S. broken promises and blocking diplomacy that it just won't do it. But I hope that at least this agreement, this prisoner agreement, creates some momentum to at least try to have some diplomacy inside Ukraine.
Well, it shows diplomacy can take place anytime the U.S. wants it, but the U.S.'s arm had to be twisted, as they tacitly acknowledge when they say Putin is snatching people off the streets so that he can get deals. It's like the same thing that took place when the diplomatic channels to Gaza were completely cut off. There was only one recourse in order to restore diplomacy. I was watching the coverage live last night. CNN was announcing it like it was an Olympic sport. And Biden and we were all hands and hearts watching Evan Gershkovich's plane descend, freedom for these American captives, innocent people who were taken off the streets, and Putin received in exchange an assassin, a hitman. And we kept hearing about the assassin, the assassin, the assassin. We never heard who his target was, except that neocons keep referring to him as Chechen dissident. Zelimkhan Kangashvili is the so-called Chechen dissident. This is Chechen dissident Zelimkhan Kangashvili, who is cut down in Berlin in dissident gear. Who was he? And what really happened there?
Well, it's amazing. Everyone refers to, as you said, as a Chechen dissident. The Washington Post calls them that. Democracy Now! Calls them that. Nobody pointed out that he was a militant who took part in the insurgency in Chechnya and, was responsible for killing a number of Russian soldiers, including prisoners of war, allegedly. And he also happened to be a CIA informant, which people don't mention for some reason. They just call him a dissident. But he worked very closely with the CIA. A few people have acknowledged that. For example, neocon pundit Michael Weiss, who Grayzone readers might remember from his active involvement in the Syria dirty war. He wrote this: a note on the victim of FSB hitman. I note on the victim of the FSB hitman that Putin got back. Zelikman Kangoshvili wasn't just a Chechen fighter turned dissident. He was an agent of Georgia security services and a CIA informant who helped counter both FSB and Islamist ops in Georgia. So Michael Weiss there is trying to highlight just what a hero this guy was because he was a CIA informant. That's because Michael Weiss is a neocon.
A neocon and a spook.
Yeah, well,
so from one spook honoring another.
Yeah, but it's just so funny. So he has at least the honesty to acknowledge that this guy hailed as a Chechen dissident was actually a CIA asset. And again, what everybody omits, including Michael Weiss, is that he didn't just counter the FSB. He literally killed Russian soldiers and allegedly killed Russian prisoners of war in a really gruesome way, which somehow gets whitewashed and totally omitted from the story. So instead, what we're supposed to believe is that basically Putin wanted this guy back because he wanted to defend somebody who killed a Chechen dissident, not bring somebody back who avenged the killing of Russian soldiers, which, if the U.S. was in a similar situation, they'd want the exact same thing. Somebody who was convicted of killing U.S. soldiers, the U.S. would, of course, want that person back.
That's why the U.S. likely supported the Israeli assassination of Fuad Shukr, who is accused by by Israel. We don't know if it's true, of involvement in the attack on the Marine barracks in 1983 in Lebanon. It's why the U.S., this is confirmed, supported Israel's strike, killing Imad Mugniya, who it also blames for that attack in Damascus years ago. So the U.S. has done the same thing, and Kangashvili was being given sanctuary in Berlin. It was a brazen act, for sure.
So it just, it's just amazing. And then people then look at this and say, well, look at the contrast, but Putin wants convicted killers freed, and we just want dissidents freed. And when really it misses the context that the hitman that Putin wanted freed was he killed someone who had killed Russians and allegedly in a really gruesome way. So yeah.
Okay, so on that note, there are two more points I want to make on this prisoner swap, because Americans never get the information they deserve to be able to understand what actually took place. Because if they do, they would start to see Putin as someone other than a totalitarian psychopath who's completely irrational. And they might see him as a ruthless leader whose back has been against the wall. And there were dissidents who were exchanged here, for sure. Vladimir Kara-Murza is someone who was he was a dissident, but he was backed by the U.S., possibly a CIA asset, but definitely backed by the U.S. government. He didn't kill people. He was outspoken. He wanted to overthrow the Russian government and balkanize Russia. And there were other dissidents who were released from the Free Russia Foundation, things that are basically backed by the US government, that are determined to undermine the government of Russia. Kangashvili was not a dissident. It's absurd to call him that. But then you have the whole case of Evan Gershkovich. And Evan Gershkovich, okay, let's just see how The Guardian reported on this, because I decided today to see if any media outlet wanted to report on why Evan Gershkovich was arrested. This is the Wall Street Journal reporter who became sort of a cause celeb for all of the mainstream DC Beltway media people. And understandably, he's their colleague. Okay. how Evan Gershkovich was finally freed in a 500-day odyssey. We're getting a lot of reports. There's a major feature in the Wall Street Journal on how he was freed. It doesn't say much about why he was jailed in the first place. And it's really impossible to get these details. The Russian government said Gershkovich had been recruited by the CIA to collect information about the country's larger producer of main battle tanks. That seems like a kind of a major detail there. Now, let's just put aside whether he was a CIA agent or not. I can't prove that. That's what Russia says. Let's just look at how he was arrested. Evan Gershkovich was sent by his Wall Street Journal editors, apparently, by seniors, higher ups in the Wall Street Journal, to Yekaterinburg in central Russia, in a private vehicle, not taking public transportation, in a private vehicle, so kind of making it harder for the FSB to track him and drawing suspicion to him. Something that, I'm told from media professionals in Russia is something that Western reporters are not supposed to do. And he goes to a munitions plant and is attempting to interview workers at the plant about what they're producing, what kind of parts, how fast they're able to produce. Okay, let's just take out whether he's a CIA agent, that whole part. We know many people in the media are CIA assets, that's for sure, but we don't know. We're not going to say he is. He's a young guy. He's not like an old seasoned veteran. Why would the Wall Street Journal and its editors send him on an assignment like that with Russia in the middle of a war that's cracking down on all anti-war activists, in a kind of in a siege mentality? Why would they send him there? And the Wall Street Journal reported that a reporter previously was hounded by the FSB and Russian police on a similar or the same assignment and had to escape from his hotel room. So why are they sending him out there? Where's the accountability at the Wall Street Journal for sending this young guy into what was basically a journalistic suicide mission? And what does it say about the Wall Street Journal and who's pulling their strings that they would want to do this?
Yeah, exactly.
There's no way a Russian reporter in the United States would go to a Lockheed Martin facility and start asking questions and not immediately have the FBI pull them off the street. It would be a front page story. So,
and not just a Lockheed Martin facility, but a Lockheed Martin facility during a war, right? This is like during a war on Russia's border.
Yeah.
And you're asking about really sensitive military secrets. There's no, if a Russian reporter did that, exactly, they'd be treated to the exact same punishment that Evan Gershkovich was subjected to. And I agree with you. The people at the Wall Street Journal who sent him on that assignment need to be held accountable. It's so reckless. They basically sent him off to be arrested. I mean, and that's what happened to him. And of course, it has to be pointed out, the campaign to free him, it came in parallel to complete disinterest in the campaign to free Julian Assange by the same establishment media reporters. And also, this news comes just as Israel kills 2 more Al Jazeera journalists. One of them, his head was blown off in its vehicle as they were covering the murder of Ismail Haniyeh. And of course, none of these journalists in the U.S. care about that. So
this is Ismail Al-Ghul, who is the main correspondent for Al Jazeera, beloved by the media professionals in Gaza, a young guy, 27,
yeah,
covering the genocide from start to finish, took more risks than I would take in 100 lifetimes, and was deliberately targeted for just simply trying to carry out interviews outside the destroyed home of Ismail Haniyeh, had his head blown off. And nothing. The State Department refuses to even say it was a war crime. So yeah, that is another point worth making, but I think there needs to be accountability at the top of the Wall Street Journal, and they should also be asking questions about whether the US government and some of the 3-letter agencies had pushed them to send this young reporter. Evan Gershkovich might just be a brave reporter who thought he was going to uncover a big story. All the pack of Western media people in Russia are all against the Kremlin. So it's not like out of the ordinary that he would want to get compromising info or info about Russia's defense production capacity. That doesn't mean he's a CIA agent. But it's the seniors, the higher ups at the Wall Street Journal, and what it says about this institution. You need to answer that.
Yeah, we should point out, I mean, Russia had a trial for him, but it was done very quickly, and I don't think they presented any evidence at all that he's a CIA asset. But again, I agree with you. The accountability starts at the top of the Wall Street Journal. Why was he on such a reckless assignment that the U.S. would never tolerate if there were a Russian journalist in the U.S.? And we're never going to get an answer to that question because there's never any accountability for these types of decisions. Everybody now is just going to like pretend that decision wasn't made, and they're going to focus on the fact that he's free now and celebrate Biden as this great negotiator, even though, according to that Wall Street Journal article that you mentioned, Biden is not a very prominent figure. It looks like Tucker Carlson played a bigger role maybe than Biden did, and other people as well.
So yeah, this is another point I wanted to make, is this is the Wall Street Journal's big feature on how Gerskovich and the others were freed. Paul Whelan also, who, we're told he was just visiting a friend for a wedding in Moscow. We don't have time to get into that one. Just as Berlin and Washington outlined how a deal would work, Moscow was dealing with an unexpected new interlocutor, Tucker Carlson. The former Fox News host was hammering out terms for an interview with Putin for his new straight-to-social media talk show. Carlson told the president's aides that he planned to request Putin free Gerskovich on the spot during the interview. If all went well, he would take Evan home on his flight. An official close to Putin told the TV host it would be a, quote, great idea and could generate a positive response. Near the end of his 2-hour conversation, Tucker pushed his point. This guy is obviously not a spy. He's just a kid. Now, remember how much hate Tucker Carlson got from the people who wanted Evan Gerskovich out for just daring to go and interview Vladimir Putin. He was called a Russian asset. They were basically calling for him to be arrested, accusing him of treason, and he played a more pivotal role than any of them did in getting him out, because that's how you do things. That's how backdoor diplomacy takes place, is a prominent media person goes and actually meets with the president, who no one else from the government wants to be in the room with. Donald Trump tried to do it. They initiated impeachment hearings against him. So, Tucker Carlson deserves credit for this as much as anyone.
Yeah. And he won't get it.
And he'll never get it from these hacks. It's amazing to read this Wall Street Journal article, though, because they don't insult Tucker. They just call him a former Fox News host, because I guess maybe they spoke to him on background or something, but it's like the one time when they can't call him, racist extremist. And Jake Sullivan, I mean, what they say about him in this article, they make him out to be like this boy genius. It's really incredible.
And again, just to underscore the point, the fact that Tucker Carlson met with Putin, pressed him on this, it underscores that when you engage with people in a respectful way, and forget even like your tone, just you engage to begin with, which the U.S. has refused to do when it comes to the Ukraine war, you can possibly yield results. I mean, what if the Tucker Carlson approach was mirrored when it comes to diplomacy with Russia over ending the Ukraine war? I mean, the answer is obvious. You would have ended this war years ago, because there were tangible results. There was the Istanbul peace deal that almost was, until the U.S. blocked it. So again, it's more evidence that engagement can very often produce positive results, but that's not what the U.S. is interested in, because engagement undermines hegemony, which is its superseding priority.
And remember, let's just say we played a very indirect role in this at the Grayzone. This is all public. Anya Parampil tried to help Tucker Carlson get his interview with Vladimir Putin. She went to Putin's deputy foreign minister, who she interviewed at the non-aligned meeting in Venezuela, just interviewed him as a journalist about BRICS and the multipolar world, and tried to facilitate that interview. And her emails with Tucker Carlson were leaked to the press by the NSA, the National Security Agency, completely flagrantly violated the privacy and constitutional rights of a private American citizen and journalist, Tucker Carlson, just to embarrass him for trying to interview Putin. But it was through those contacts and Tucker's perseverance that he managed to get that interview and generate more momentum to free this Wall Street Journal journalist and initiate diplomacy.
And I remember when Tucker Carlson announced that on his show, he knew about it because a whistleblower from the NSA or the US government came and told him that this was about to happen. He was mocked even for announcing that his emails were being surveilled and that the US government was trying to undermine his attempts to interview Vladimir Putin. But look what it led to. Look what it led to. And again, nobody who actually played a positive role here by engaging with the Russian government like he did will receive any credit. And engagement, the idea of engagement, I don't think that's going to get much play either, because we're still locked into this proxy war with Russia, and everyone in power is very committed to that still.
Yeah. And Tucker was also mocked for saying that someone was going to try to assassinate Donald Trump like 2 months before it happened. So then you just can't state the obvious in public sometimes. Anyway, rare diplomacy in the face of looming regional war. Doesn't seem to be any real diplomacy coming from Washington there, except probably threats, mostly sticks and not many carrots towards Iran to not defend itself. It's going to have to do it, I think, to maintain any deterrence against Israel. Because if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. So we'll be watching. We'll be back. I got a hard stop now, unless there's anything you want to add, Aaron.
Nope. Thanks for watching, supporting the Grayzone. The links to do so are on there on the screen. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Support the Grayzone. Support the kind of journalism we just did with Kit Clarenberg, exposing the National Endowment for Democracy, America's regime change meddling machine, and creating the biggest PR fiasco for it by simply explaining their history publicly to one of their VPs.
We'll have to discuss that next time, because that's an amazing story. For those who haven't read it, it's hilarious how basically Max and Alex Rubinstein caused a meltdown at the National Endowment for Democracy, an organization funded to destabilize governments, ended up being destabilized on its own and by an outlet that happens to report on its actual role. So we'll have to discuss that next time, because it's an amazing story.
Absolutely. So we'll see you next time. Thank you for supporting, for subscribing, and peace.